IIS Part 2. In this nugget, we'll be discussing Internet Information Server again, and this will be Part 2. We'll start with the discussion of the virtual directories, and we'll pretty much pick up seamlessly where we left off with our last nugget. We'll create virtual directories because you don't keep all of your web information only on the home page. Of course, you'll have subdirectories that it needs to go into. Then we'll also have site properties, and this is a continued discussion of our site properties that we started with, Part 1. Remember, site properties are probably 90% of the administration of IIS, so there's quite a lot involved there, and they're pretty involved dialog boxes. And we'll take a look at the authentication and securing of IIS. Several different methods for authentication and identifying who the users are that are accessing your web, in addition to the fact that you can use anonymous open access. Then we'll look at how to backup and restore IIS, not just the files themselves, because you'll probably have a regular backup solution that backs up the files, but the configuration is what's important there, because even after you restore files from a backup, there's no way of having them automatically reconfigured unless you can restore from your metabase. We'll take a look at FTP as well. FTP is kind of a minor topic here, because most of the configuration is very similar to your web configuration. And in fact, if you can configure your web configuration, pretty good chance you can configure your FTP configuration also. Now, before we get back to the properties of these web pages, let me also point out another thing here, and that is you're not going to keep all of your content on www.whateveryourcompany.is.com. I mean, you have virtual directories underneath that, or subdirectories is how we would think of it. So you're not going to keep it all on the same page right there at the front on the home page. You need to create what we call virtual directories. Now, you have virtual directories that you could create from file. If there's already a configuration file, an XML file, that designates where that virtual directory content is and what security is on it and all that kind of stuff, you can choose this from file, or you can just create it from scratch, which will start this wizard for us. And then we enter in an alias. The alias will be what they type in after they type in the home page. So, for example, if I'm www.cbtnuggets.com and I want people to give me feedback about my site, then maybe I'll have a /feedback. And then I'll click on Next here and enter in a path which I've already created in advance for the content of this under a web directory here. And then I'll just go ahead and click on Next. Now notice that the actual physical directory is a web subdirectory, actually a web directory, but when you just type the directory in the browser, it's going to be /feedback. So it's not physical, it's not the same physical location, and that's why we call it an alias in that first page of the dialog box. And we'll just give it read, run, and so forth as necessary here. This is going to be a feedback form they may need to write as well, and you may need to coordinate this with whoever's developing your web applications to see whether that's a necessity. You also may need to see if there's a necessity to work with or interoperate with a back-end database of some kind. But in any case, here we've got a feedback form, and now what I could do is go ahead and go to a web browser, go www.cbtnuggets.com, and then /feedback, and it takes me to a feedback page, and I just kind of took this off of front page, and it's unedited, but you can just use your imagination, make whatever changes are necessary for your own purposes for documents like this. Now, another thing to point out is that recall that when I designated this feedback alias, it went to drive D on a different drive and yet on my same computer. It might be useful to do that if you want to offload the hard disk burden onto another physical drive within your same system and provide it SCSI, or if it's on a different bus, then you will be able to distribute the load within the same system. So that's one advantage of going to a different drive. Another advantage would be it helps to obscure security so that users, when they go to this feedback form, they don't realize that they're not actually going to a physical subdirectory of your web content, and they don't realize that it's not called feedback. So that if someone is able to somehow sneak in and do directory browsing, they're not going to be able to find this immediately. Also, you could put it on an entirely different server, so that wherever the content for feedback is on a different server, different part of your network. The advantage of that is, again, you can offload some of the burden, provided that the two servers, the web server and the content server, have good connectivity and good available bandwidth. And the additional advantage there is also security, so that if someone hacks into the IIS web server, at least the content is on a different server and would require yet another set of clever hacks to be able to access it. Now, returning to our properties for a website, we go to the Performance tab, and we see that we can limit the network bandwidth available to the site. A lot of times an ISP will do that. If, for example, down here they got a couple hundred websites that are run by, Billy Joe, Jim Bob, and he only pays $3.99 a month for each site, well, since he's paying such a low price, we're going to throttle his bandwidth down to 28K per second or something like that, because he's getting the economy value there. So we're giving him economy bandwidth. We can also specify website connections as unlimited, which is the default, or we can specify it to a specific number. And again, if we got Billy Joe Jim Bob's websites down here and he's only paying $3.99 a month, then we're not going to give him the premium of unlimited web connections. We're going to give him, only 10 connections at a time or something like that. Now also on the iispart filters, which is beyond our scope, this allows us to configure a program to respond to a server request. And it's kind of similar to iispart extensions, which are little applications, except that iispart filters always run in a server process, and they're different because they're driven by web server events, and they're not really driven by the client's specific request. Normally, these are designed for something on the administrator's side. The users will probably never know that there's been an iispart filter, or never see the effect of the iispart filter. For example, you might configure an iispart filter or ask for your developer to configure one for you that identifies which kind of browser and which version of browser all the users are accessing when they access this web, and that might be useful for you to collect information, but which would not be important for the user. Then we have the home directory. And this is where we specify exactly where the content should come from. In other words, in this case, it was directly located on this computer, but it could be a share located on another computer. Sometimes that's a good security measure, because if you want to protect that data, that actual web content, and it has security sensitivity, then since it's on another computer, that would require an additional set of credentials in order for someone to be able to access it, so that even if they compromise your web server, they would have to go through yet another set of credentials to access the web content over on another computer. You can also redirect it to another URL. This might be useful again if I'm, Hewlett-Packard, I've bought Compaq. Now, whenever someone types in www.compaq.com, we want them to go to, hp.com or, www.hp.com or something like that. If I can type. Anyway, you get the idea here. Okay, so we can direct them to that exact URL that you see, or a directory below the URL. Now, if you do that, then it would not be exactly like this, because which directory below it would it go to? That's not really the point of this one. This one would be like, well, if we did go to hp.com, maybe every time someone goes there, Hewlett-Packard wants everybody to go to the products subdirectory so that they can start shopping. So that might be useful in that case, and that would just take them to that subdirectory. Or you can also take them to a permanent redirection for this resource, and that might be useful for things such as bookmarks. And this would then update the user's bookmarks potentially if the browser is compatible with that. All right, let's go ahead and take a look also at our custom errors. Now, when you go to a website and there's a problem with it, either DNS couldn't resolve the name, or the page was not found, or any number of other kinds of problems that could occur, it will deliver back to the client an HTTP error. And along with that HTTP error will be an associated file from whoever's running that web page. These are all the default ones that Microsoft has already provided for us. Most of these will be just fine for current purposes, for most purposes. However, you might want to customize some of these to suit yourself. For example, if you go into the file system, notice that these are all located under Windows, and then on the Windows directory, then they're located under Help, and then they're located under IIS Help, and then Common. And then here under Common, we see the actual HTML files themselves, and this is one of the most common ones we've seen. And that's the page cannot be found. How many times have you seen that one? Too many times, right? The HTTP error portion of it down here is from the browser. This is actually, the top part of this is actually what's provided by Microsoft. And of course, you can adjust this as necessary, so that if you want to, edit this, and I've got Front Page installed, so when I right-click on Choose Edit, it automatically pops this open. And you might put on here a link for a troubleshooting form, or a link for a notification to the webmaster so that they can fix the problem, something like that. Or we might change the text like I've done here, just for a little bit of fun. Okay, so that gives you an idea for what happens with those HTTP messages. Let's go back over here and also take a look at some of the other things we can see. Now, the HTTP headers section has a really important portion, and that is this Enable Content Expiration item. And we very often will select this and select it to expire after a certain period of time. Otherwise, what could happen if we leave this clear is we might be updating our web content periodically, but if a user has been accessing our website on a regular basis, then the website is going to be cached, all the content is going to be cached in their local Internet Explorer cache. Therefore, when they access it, it's just going to deliver to them the cached information. Well, if we enable content expiration, then along with that cached information is a timer, if you will, of when it should expire, so that if they were here the day before yesterday and this content is set to expire in 1 day, then the next time they visit that, the cache will be outdated and it will know to look to the website directly to, again, get the information from the IIS server here. You might also just specify any number of different periods of time depending on how time sensitive the information is and how frequently it changes. It might even expire it immediately if it's something that's something that changes frequently, like stock quotes or something like this. And you can also expire on a certain day. For example, if you have a certain online coupon that you only want to be available for the next month, well, you can expire it 30 days from current date. Now you can also add custom HTTP headers. For example, if you install or enable ASP.NET on this IIS web server, then it's going to have a custom header for that, which gives it additional functionality. Other functionality, for example, might be a certain header that you can add here that would cache any internet content on the user's local internet browser cache, but it would not cache it on a proxy server, which is a kind of server that retrieves internet content on behalf of all your corporate users, so that when one user accesses it, it caches it on the proxy server, and then subsequent hits for that same content from other clients will be delivered right out of the proxy server instead of having to go out to the internet to get it fresh. And that saves out on your network bandwidth, internet bandwidth, as well as your local network bandwidth. And it improves the performance, of course. Now, one of the other kind of things you can do is to edit ratings, and you might want to do this if you have a website that is potentially offensive in certain degrees. And if you're socially conscious, you might check enable ratings for this content, and that way people with children or socially sensitive persons who might be offended by some of these various kinds of items can set up their Internet Explorer settings to block out certain kinds of things, such as language. You can have inoffensive slang. You see how this is all rated, explicit and crude language. You get that a lot in server rooms, as well as violence sometimes, killing with blood and gore and all that kind of stuff. We don't seem to get any of these other two things in server rooms, but anyway, at least there's something there. You can also enter in an email address of a person rating this content, and that's really useful if you want to get criticized on a regular basis. I just enter in my boss's name there and my boss's email address. And then you can expire everything on a certain date, and if you do specify that, then what happens is it becomes an unrated site at whatever date you specify here. Now, the MIME types we already addressed when we looked at the properties of DC Nugget 1 for the IIS server's properties, and it has several MIME types already included. If you want to add additional MIME types only for this website specifically, then you could add those here. Then we can also take a look at directory security, and then with this we can specify what kind of access control we want to enable. Authentication and access control by default is going to be anonymous access. Now, with this, what happens is it automatically creates an IUSR underscore name of the server, whatever the name of your web server is. It creates that account as your anonymous account when you install IIS, and then there's a password that the system creates for you. You don't have to be concerned about that. And if you look at the properties of this account in Active Directory users and computers, you'll see that the password never expires. Likewise, the user cannot change the password, which is useful because if someone ever does exploit this account, we don't want them to change the password. And then because the password on the account doesn't match the password here, we don't want it to bring down all of your web servers. So that's kind of important. Of course, you can browse for another account if you feel the need to do that. Remember a little while ago, I was accessing the webpage cbtnuggets.com, and right before we got to the picture of the gorilla there, it gave me credentials. It gave me an opportunity to enter in credentials. That's because we were trying to access it using NTFS Access Control List. Remember, that content was stored in the trainer's account underneath the My Documents directory. And because of that, only the system administrators and the trainer account itself had any access to it, and there was no broad access to like everyone full control or any other kind of broad access. So when we tried to access it, it queried us with integrated Windows authentication for our credentials. Now, integrated Windows authentication uses Windows NT Challenge response authentication, so that means that it will hash or kind of put in a mathematical blender and scramble my credentials before it sends it across the network. That way, if someone intercepts them, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to read them. So there is some level of security in that. There's no level of security in basic authentication. Very few times you'd ever want to use this. And if you select this checkbox, in fact, you get a big warning because the password is going to be sent in clear text. And anybody with even a basic packet sniffer will be able to read the password in seconds. And in fact, you get this big message if you say that you want to use this. And the only way to secure it would be to use something like a secure socket layer connection, which is what it says right down here. So we don't want to go ahead and use that. Now, digest authentication will encrypt the password and the credentials when it sends them across the network. The advantage of using this is this will also work across a proxy server, whereas some of these others may not be available for working across a proxy server. Also, as you can see here, it only works with domain accounts, and when you do that, you need to also specify a realm. Now, why they have to say realm here, I don't know, because it's really an Active Directory domain. Active Directory domains do follow along the lines of a Kerberos realm. They're really the same kind of a thing, but it just seems like the wording would be better if they said domain there instead. In any case, then you select which realm or domain you want and click OK, and so whatever credentials are supplied with digest authentication will then have to come out of this Active Directory domain. Also bear in mind that you have to have HTTP 1.1 compatibility in order to make the digest authentication work. And then finally here you can also use .NET Passport authentication, and that will allow you to use the Microsoft .NET Passport for a single sign-on kind of a functionality. And as with the digest authentication, you would need to then select a domain in this case, and again you just select whichever one applies, and there you go. And then you can also specify access by IP address and domain name restrictions. By default, of course, everyone's granted access, and that's going to be common for publicly available websites. And you might grant them access with the following exceptions. Anyone except for a hacking attempt we saw in our logs from this IP address, a 66.224. Whatever, some IP address in this. Then you can also do a DNS lookup if you wanted to resolve the IP address to a name. Then you can also select a group of computers. In that case, you would enter in a network ID, which would be common if you wanted to restrict an entire subnet, for example. Maybe you have a training room where you have employees that have not matched security clearances yet of some kind, and you want to restrict that entire training room ID with its subnet mask, accompanying subnet mask, from being able to access a certain kind of web. Or you might restrict an entire domain name. Maybe you have a competitor from, some other domain, and you want to restrict their domain entirely, even from viewing your public web pages on the internet, just out of spite or something like that. Then you can also deny access to everyone except for, and then we're kind of flipping the coin here, looking at the other side of this, except for a single computer. So only one computer in this case would be able to access that particular web. And you could add multiple single computers by clicking OK and then clicking Add again. And then you can also do a group of computers. For example, if the Human Resources subnet is the only one that's supposed to be able to access this web server because it has our benefit package information, our retirement plans, our salaries, all that kind of thing. And then, again, you can restrict everyone except for anyone from a certain domain name. So similar ideas there. Just, again, the flip side of the coin. Now, for the highest level of security, you can use a server certificate. By clicking on server certificate here, if I don't already have one installed, and I know I don't, otherwise this view certificate would not be grayed out like it is. But if I could click this, it would allow me to either create a certificate or to install a certificate that I have available already, and I could just install it from a file, for example. Once you've gotten your server certificate installed here, then SSL connections would be available. And remember, anytime someone tries to connect with an SSL connection, they must type not HTTP, but HTTPS at the beginning of their browser in the address field. And once you have that configured, you can also click on Edit here and require Secure Socket Layer Encryption, or SSL encryption. You can also require 128-bit encryption, which also requires more processor utilization. That's why if you go to your banking website or your credit card website or some other website that requires 128-bit encryption, a lot of times you'll notice that it takes a little while to retrieve the information. That's because this 128-bit encryption is processor intensive, therefore it takes a little longer to retrieve that data. Now the client certificates requirements are you can either ignore client certificates, or you can accept them if they're offered but they're not required, or you can require client certificates for the highest level of security, and if the user does not present a certificate, then they cannot access the web. Then you can also enable client certificate mapping, and that allows, for example, a one-to-one mapping where you can have each certificate from each client would map to a specific user account, and you might even just use domain accounts or some other kind of generic accounts, whatever applies. Or when you click on Edit, instead of going one-to-one, which is what I just described, you can also go many-to-one. And the difference with these is that the one-to-one will map a single user account to a single certificate, and if the user changes their certificate, then you have to remap that account. the server will also hold a copy of that client certificate. So there does have to be that level of administration. There's quite a lot more work that has to be done if you use one-to-one. There's also many-to-one, and the difference here is that it has the capability of wildcard client certificate matching. This doesn't mean that it takes a specific certificate. It can take a certificate with a certain criteria, including wildcard requirements, and map them to a single user account. And then whichever one you use, the user account that's used with the certificate then is the one that is used to log on the user. And then finally there's the Documents tab here, and this will specify what the file name is that's in the directory where the user is pointing their browser. And the user doesn't actually have to type in default or index.html or any of these files. What happens is when they go to that directory, if there is a document with one of these names, it will look for that document for the user, and it automatically provides it. And it provides it in the order of preference that you see here, so that if they have both a default.html and an index.html, it would point them to the default.html and open that first. And of course, you can move these up and down. Then there's also a document footer. With this, you can simply put in a directory location for pre-created HTML content, and this is something so that you don't have to repetitively type in the same thing at the bottom of each web page. And instead, it'll be in the footer. And it might be something like a copyright statement or, a phone number for your company or something like that. Now let me also point out how to back up your web server, because this is pretty critical. I mean, if something bad happens to this web server, and we've got, hundreds of websites underneath here, then I might have to reconstruct all these websites along with all their configuration and everything from scratch. Wow, that would just be nearly like impossible to do in a timely fashion. So if this does blow up, then I can restore at least the files from a backup or something like that, the actual web content, but the actual configuration would need to come from somewhere else, and that will be by right-clicking on the server, choosing all tasks, and then backup restore configuration. Notice that there are several automated backups that have already been made. Every time it sees a change, it'll automatically create a backup, and I can also restore one of these backups then if I realize that, a little bit earlier today I had a good copy of this website, of this web server. Now I don't. I'll just click restore there and hopefully get myself back to a known good configuration. Otherwise, I just click create backup and then enter in a name for it. I can just call this the Save Us From Disaster backup name, and then I'll encrypt it using a certain password if I want, which might be necessary because I don't want someone else to be able to access this backup and derive sensitive information about our web. So then I'll click OK there, or actually about our entire web server. So then I'll click OK there. Now we've got our Save Us From Disaster web, and then later on, if I want to come back into this, I can restore it. Also, if I choose another backup, and I create another backup using the same name, then I can also create a different version. And for example, here I'm creating another Save Us From Disaster backup and click OK, and that will give us both a version 0 and a version 1. So just so you know, if you have two of the same names, it'll version them for you. And then to restore it, you simply click Restore, and then it says, are you sure you want to do this? Can be a lengthy process, especially if you've got dozens or hundreds of complicated web presence, websites in there. I'll just go ahead and click on yes. It won't hurt anything. We haven't changed anything anyway. And then what will happen is it'll restore 2 key XML files. Then it'll also prompt me for the password, and I click OK, and we'll go ahead and restore the database. When it's done, we get the operation completed successfully dialog box there and close it, and we're back in business. Now also note that when you do restore the database, it does stop all of IIS. So every website you have in this, even if it's only because one of the websites was goofed up and all the rest of them were okay, it's going to stop everything and take that period of time to restore. So that could give you unacceptable downtime, and you might just have to tell whoever this website is, hey, you're going to have to wait until 3 a.m. because we can't bring everybody else down in the meantime. Now, another thing it could do is, especially if maybe this website here is problematic, they're using a testing an application, it's not always working properly, then you can right-click here, choose all tasks, and then you can save their configuration to a file. That basically makes a backup, except that it's only this one single website, and then you just type the name here and use the password again if you want to, and that's pretty much it. And as long as I mentioned that there were a couple of files involved in the backup, let me point out what these are. These two Metabase files, these two XML files, the schema and the base file are the files that are actually backed up. And if you double click on one of these, then you can actually see the information. You can see that this does relate to the configuration of the web server. And that's what this whole top section, for example, is. For example, remember there was that one setting when we looked at the properties of the web server that enabled metabase editing while IIS was running. Well, that's what this is. If we check that checkbox, it changes the value from 0 to 1. We also have the enable history setting here so that when a change is detected in the IIS configuration, it makes a backup. It gives us the maximum bandwidth available, gives us a maximum history file, so it'll store up to 10 history files at a time. You can manually change that here as well. Anything beyond that goes into XML into a lot more scope than is our purpose at this time, but you at least get an idea how important these XML files are and the kind of information that they contain. Now, you may have noticed as we were administering web servers and websites there that we didn't see anything about FTP. So I've returned to Add Remove Programs under the Windows Components wizard, where we'll go back to Application Server, and where I've already installed FTP for you just to save a little bit of time. It's really just one checkbox. Just go back to IIS down here, go to its details, then go to this FTP, File Transfer Protocol FTP service, check that box, OK everything, and when you're done, then you'll have FTP also in the Internet Information Services Manager item. So if we expand DC Nugget 1 now, we see that we now also have FTP sites along with a single default FTP site. Now, in terms of the FTP properties, they're mostly the same as your website properties, except that there are even fewer options. But if we go to the properties, we see that, for example, we have all the site identification is the same. We do have to have a unique IP address and port number with our FTP sites, just the same way we did with websites. And since we don't have an option for an advanced button over here that gave us our host header names, then we don't have that option, so we would have to definitely give ourselves uniqueness here. We can also limit site connections, as we see down in this option. And then the only other thing here is the current sessions item. If I have a connection right here where I'm connected to an FTP site, then if I go to IIS and go to current sessions right here, I can see who's connected, how long they've been connected, and then I can disconnect them if I suspect that they're a miscreant of some kind, or if I need to bring it down for maintenance or something like that. Of course, there's no way to notify them directly within this interface, especially if they're public internet users, so you can't just do it like a net send a message to them or something, so you might want to do that during periods of least productivity. Now, for FTP sites, notice that we don't have the same kind of authentication. We don't have digest authentication. We don't have basic authentication or any of the other kinds of integrated authentications that are available. This is just very, very plain access, and when you connect using these anonymous connections, it's going to transmit the username and password in clear text. Now, with an anonymous connection like this, using the anonymous internet user account, this is not going to transmit a password from the client side to the server. It's just going to allow it to automatically use this account. However, if I browse and select a special account, an Active Directory account or a local account, and then someone has to actually enter in a username and password, be aware of the fact that usernames and passwords with FTP are transmitted in clear text, and anyone can snatch them out of the ether by using a packet sniffer. There's really no way to secure that unless you use third-party security, or unless you can secure it using HTTPS connections or secure socket layers, something like that. But by itself, you really can't secure FTP. And so that's another reason why with FTP we really recommend that you only use this for broad company-based files that you don't care if the whole world has access to. Like maybe you have drivers if you're a developer of some kind. Or maybe you have public PDF files that you want people to be able to read, that kind of stuff. You can also allow only anonymous connections, and the thing that's handy about that is that prevents someone from being able to log on with an administrator account remotely, for example, and then getting into this FTP site and start fiddling around with it and making unauthenticated, or rather unauthorized, modifications to it that we don't really want. So this, it looks like it limits your abilities, and it does, but that really is good because it prevents someone from hacking the account pretty much. Now the messages items here will only appear if you're accessing FTP through many third-party clients or through a command line, the FTP command line. If you access it through Internet Explorer, these are not going to appear. But the banner message would appear as soon as they access the site and before they log on. The welcome message appears after they log on. The exit message, of course, appears as they exit. And the maximum connections would appear as soon as they have exceeded whatever the maximum number of connections are here. Then the maximum connections message would appear if, for example, our 100,000th and first user attempted to connect to the website or to the FTP site. Then the home directory can be, again, located on this computer or on another computer, just like the web. And with this, we also have by default read access, which means that people could download from our FTP, but they cannot upload unless we select on write. The directory listing style for Unix is a 4-digit date. MS-DOS is 2-digit dates. You can change this through the metabase if you want to a 4-digit date. And then the directory security is the same as what we've had with our websites. Now to create a new FTP site, it's real simple. You just right-click on FTP sites, similar to what we did with websites, and choose a new FTP site from the right-click menu, and then choose Next to start the wizard, and enter in a description for it. We'll just call this one, Projects, and then click Next. Then we have to have uniqueness here. One or the other of these items has to be unique. We already have all unassigned at port 21 for the default FTP site, so I'll specify an individual IP address, and we should be okay to keep the TCP port because we now have uniqueness. And then from here, we can allow users to be isolated or not isolated. If we don't isolate users, then users could potentially access FTP directories for other users. Or we could isolate users so that they have a local account that's mapped to a home directory for the account, or isolate users using Active Directory in the Active Directory user account. And these two options at the bottom would prevent users from being able to browse through and look at other users' home directories and potentially make changes. We'll go ahead and enter in a path as well, and we enter in a location. We'll just call this Projects Directory as well, and then Next. And then you give it read or write access, and then Next and Finish, and that's pretty much it. And then to go ahead and create a virtual directory, simply right-click and choose New Virtual Directory. Once again, we can do this from a file. If there had been a previous virtual directory here, and we want to recreate the existing virtual directory that we'd had in the past, provided the source files are still there, we could do it from a file as long as we had our metabase files available, which, remember, are those XML files. We'll just do it from scratch and choose Next, and we simply enter in an alias. Maybe I want to call this manuals. Maybe we have some user manuals available in the projects, and I've also got a physical directory called manuals. And remember, again, this does not have to be a physical directory located within the exact same location. In my case, it is. It's a subdirectory of projects, which I created earlier, but I could put this on a UNC path or some other location as well. Then we go ahead and click Next, and again, read or write permission, and that's pretty much it. And then you're finished, and now you have your virtual directory. In this nugget, we picked up where we left off on our last nugget, which was iispart2, and now here we're on iispart2. We start off with a discussion of virtual directories because you don't want to put all of your web content on the home page. I mean, there's a lot to cram in there probably. So the virtual directories are subdirectories that are located either on the same local server or elsewhere. Then we took a look at a continuing discussion of the site properties because there is quite a lot of properties involved there, and that's about 90% of your administration is involved in those properties. And then we looked at how to authenticate the clients. You want to make sure that you have the authentication that's appropriate for your environment, whether you want it to be integrated with Windows, or you want it to be basic, or just anonymous access. And then we looked at how to backup and restore IIS as well. I mean, you can do that through a standard tape backup method, which you probably already have some kind of a backup method, but that just backs up and restores the files, the contents. You still also have the configuration of the entire web, and you need to be able to do that through a backup of the metabase. And then I showed you the brief discussion of how to install and configure FTP. For the most part, if you can install and configure a website, you can do FTP as well because most of the configuration is the same. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.